People spent a lot trying to figure out what Crimson Desert even was. At first, it looked like another generic fantasy RPG trying way too hard to look cinematic. Then the gameplay dropped, and suddenly everyone stopped talking about the story and started talking about the combat. The physics looked insane, the bosses looked brutal, every clip felt like pure chaos in the best possible way. But at the same time, people were skeptical. Was this actually a real game, or just another overproduced trailer designed to farm hype before launch? Because the gaming industry has done this before. Big promises, cool trailers, and then the actual game feels completely hollow. But somehow, Crimson Desert did something most modern RPGs fail to do. It made people curious again. Before release, a lot of players already had Crimson Desert completely figured out in their heads. People looked at the trailers and instantly started making comparisons. Some called it Korean Witcher. Others thought it looked like Dragon's Dogma with prettier graphics and more explosions. And honestly, that was part of the problem. Modern RPG fans have seen this cycle too many times already. A new fantasy game gets revealed. The trailers look insane, the world looks massive, combat looks flashy. And then you actually play it and everything feels off. The world is empty. The combat has no weight. Side quests feel like chores. So when Crimson Desert started showing more gameplay, people became suspicious instead of excited. Especially because the combat looked almost too good. Characters were throwing enemies into walls, destroying objects, chaining abilities together, switching weapons mid-fight. It looked cool, but players immediately started asking the same question everyone asks now whenever a game looks too ambitious. Okay, but is this actually real gameplay? And honestly, that skepticism made sense. We are living in an era where cinematic trailers constantly lie to players. The industry trained gamers to be skeptical, especially after launches where visuals carried the marketing harder than the actual gameplay. But then something weird happened with Crimson Desert. The more gameplay people saw, the harder it became to dismiss it as fake. Small details started standing out. Enemy reactions looked dynamic instead of scripted. The movement system had actual momentum. Boss fights looked messy in a good way, not perfectly choreographed like a tech demo trying too hard to impress investors. And slowly, the conversation around the game started changing. People stopped saying, "This looks fake," and started saying, "Wait, this might actually be kind of insane." And this is where Crimson Desert completely changed the conversation. Because once people stopped arguing about whether the game was real or fake, everyone became obsessed with one thing: the combat. Not because it looked flashy, we have seen flashy combat before. The difference here was impact. Every hit looked violent, heavy, unstable. Characters were getting slammed into walls, launched off cliffs, crashing through objects. Fights did not feel clean and scripted like most modern action RPGs. They felt chaotic, almost dangerous. And honestly, that is probably why so many clips from this game exploded online. Every encounter looks slightly different. One second you are parrying attacks like some grounded medieval fighter, and the next second the game turns into absolute madness with explosions, grapples, aerial combos, and physics going completely off the rails. But somehow it still looked controlled. That balance is hard to explain unless you actually watch the gameplay carefully. A lot of action RPGs today feel overly polished in a bad way. Animations are smooth, combat is cinematic, but after 10 minutes you realize every fight plays almost the exact same. Crimson Desert avoids that feeling because the combat system seems built around momentum and improvisation instead of perfect rotations. And the bosses are probably the best example of that. Some of these fights genuinely look terrifying. Massive enemies smashing entire areas apart while the player is constantly moving, adapting, reacting. It feels less like a scripted encounter and more like surviving pure chaos. And what makes this even more interesting is that the game does not seem afraid of letting combat look messy. Most studios try way too hard to make every fight look cinematic and perfectly choreographed for trailers. Crimson Desert sometimes looks rough, unpredictable, almost off. But weirdly, that is exactly what makes it feel real. You can almost feel the panic during some encounters, the hesitation, the recovery animations, the physics interactions. It gives combat actual tension instead of just visual spectacle. And in a gaming industry where players are getting tired of copy-paste combat systems, Crimson Desert suddenly started feeling refreshing. Not because it reinvented action RPGs completely, but because it remembered something modern games often forget. Combat is supposed to feel dangerous, not just cool. But Crimson Desert is not only impressive when things are exploding on screen. The other reason people became attached to the game is the world itself. And honestly, this is where the game starts giving off a very different energy compared to most modern fantasy RPGs. A lot of open-world games today feel designed like giant checklists pretending to be adventures. The map is huge, but after a few hours you realize you are basically following icons instead of exploring naturally. Crimson Desert looks like it is trying to bring back that old feeling of genuine adventure, and the world design plays a huge role in that. The environments have verticality everywhere: mountains, cliffs, castles, forests, ruined structures. It constantly feels like there is something slightly hidden beyond your current path, and that matters more than people think. Good exploration is not about map size, it is about curiosity. The game keeps creating moments where players want to see what is over the next hill, or what happens if they climb something they probably should not be able to climb. And visually, the world has a kind of raw atmosphere that feels surprisingly grounded despite all the fantasy elements. Weather changes completely alter the mood of areas. Some scenes look calm and beautiful, and then minutes later the environment feels hostile and brutal. Wind effects, lighting, dust, rain, fire, all of it combines to make the world feel active instead of static. Even simple traversal clips started going viral because movement itself looked satisfying. Riding through forests, climbing structures, jumping across rooftops, gliding through environments. It creates that dangerous mix every open-world game wants but very few actually achieve. Freedom plus immersion. And honestly, that is probably why so many players are emotionally invested in Crimson Desert already, even before fully experiencing the entire game. It feels like a world designed to pull players into stories naturally instead of forcing content through endless menus and objectives. And in a genre where exploration often feels manufactured, Crimson Desert somehow makes wandering around look genuinely cool again. But even with all the praise surrounding Crimson Desert, the game is not untouchable. And honestly, this is the part where the conversation starts getting complicated. Because for every player calling the game ambitious, there is another one saying it feels exhausting. The pacing is probably the biggest issue. Crimson Desert constantly throws huge moments at the player, giant fights, massive environments, cinematic sequences, explosive encounters, and at first that feels incredible. But after enough hours, some players started realizing the game almost struggles to slow down. It wants every moment to feel important, and ironically, that can make certain sections feel overwhelming instead of memorable. There are moments where the game desperately needs room to breathe, but instead it keeps pushing spectacle non-stop like it is afraid players will get bored if explosions stop happening for 2 minutes. And then there is the narrative. This is probably the most divisive part of the entire experience, because the world itself feels immersive, but the storytelling sometimes struggles to match the emotional weight the game is clearly aiming for. Some characters are interesting, others feel forgettable almost immediately. Certain scenes hit hard, while others feel strangely disconnected from the actual gameplay experience. It creates this weird feeling where the game constantly flirts with greatness without fully locking into it. And the controls can also feel inconsistent at times. Not terrible, but occasionally too heavy or overly complex during chaotic combat situations, especially when the camera, physics, particle effects, and enemy attacks all start colliding at once. Some players love that messy intensity, others think it crosses the line into frustration. Even the UI became part of the discussion, because visually the game looks stunning, but menus and information systems sometimes feel cluttered compared to how cinematic the rest of the experience is. And unfortunately, repetition also starts creeping in after long sessions. Some combat encounters begin blending together. Certain activities lose impact once the initial visual spectacle wears off. And honestly, this is probably the biggest challenge Crimson Desert faces moving forward, keeping players emotionally invested after the visual shock factor fades away. Because making a game look impressive is one thing, keeping people engaged for dozens of hours is a completely different challenge. And that is where Crimson Desert still feels slightly unfinished as an overall experience. Not broken, not bad, just still searching for its final identity. And yet, 2 months later, people still cannot stop talking about Crimson Desert, which honestly says a lot in today's gaming industry. Most games disappear from the internet after a week. Players move on, the algorithm moves on, the hype dies instantly. But Crimson Desert somehow stayed in the conversation. And a huge reason for that is how ridiculously shareable the game became online. Clips from this game spread everywhere, brutal boss fights, physics chaos, players improvising insane combat sequences that look completely different from one another. One person uploads a clip getting launched across the map by a giant monster. Another posts some perfectly timed counterattack that looks straight out of an anime fight scene. The game created that rare thing modern gaming desperately wants but almost never achieves naturally. Emergent moments, moments that feel personal to the player instead of scripted by developers. And once a game starts generating those kinds of clips consistently, the internet basically starts marketing the game for free. But it is not only the combat keeping the discussion alive. The game also created constant debates around what it actually is. Some players think Crimson Desert is the future of fantasy RPGs. Others think it is an ambitious mess barely holding itself together. And honestly, both sides kind of have a point. That tension is exactly why the conversation never fully died. The game feels risky in a way most AAA projects no longer do. It is trying so many different ideas at once that even its flaws become interesting to talk about. about. And then the updates started coming. Performance improvements, balancing, fixes, small adjustments. The developers clearly understand people are watching this game closely right now, because Crimson Desert does not feel like a finished conversation yet. It feels like a game still evolving in real time. And honestly, that might be the most important thing about it. Even people who criticize the game still want to see what happens next. They still care, they still discuss it, they still come back to watch new clips and updates. And in an industry filled with safe, forgettable releases, that alone already makes Crimson Desert. And honestly, the future of Crimson Desert might be even more important than the launch itself, because right now, the game feels like it is standing at a crossroads. Pearl Abyss has been updating the game constantly, fixing systems, improving performance, adding new mechanics, and reacting to community feedback way faster than most AAA studios usually do. And now players are already looking toward the next big thing. DLC, expansions, new regions, bigger bosses. Pearl Abyss already confirmed they are exploring future expansions and post-launch content to push the game to the next level. But the real question is not whether the game will get more content. It is whether Crimson Desert can actually stay relevant long-term, because the game still has flaws. The pacing is messy sometimes. The story divides players. Some systems still feel unfinished. But even with all of that, people keep calling it one of the most memorable open-world RPGs in years. And honestly, that matters more than review scores. Truly ambitious games are rarely perfect. They are risky, weird, sometimes frustrating, but they leave an impact. And Crimson Desert absolutely leaves an impact. If Pearl Abyss keeps supporting the game at this pace, Crimson Desert could easily become one of the defining open-world games of this generation. And honestly, after spending time with Crimson Desert, I think the game becomes way better when you stop treating it like a checklist and start treating it like an adventure. This is not the kind of RPG you rush through just to reach the ending. The best moments usually happen when the game slows down for a second and lets the world, the combat, and the chaos breathe naturally. And yeah, the game still has issues. Some systems feel rough, some parts drag too long. The narrative does not always land the way it wants to. But even with all of that, Crimson Desert still feels more ambitious than most modern open-world games trying to play everything safe. It feels risky, experimental, sometimes messy, but never boring. And honestly, that alone already makes it stand out in today's gaming industry, because too many AAA games now feel perfectly polished and completely forgettable. Crimson Desert is kind of the opposite. It stumbles sometimes, but when it works, it feels incredible. And that is probably why people are still talking about it months later. Comment your experience with the game, and remember to follow for more trending game breakdowns and gaming analysis.